This is going to be a short video how to replace the rear brakes, the rear brake pads on a 1997 Volvo 850. Most of the brake hardware is the same on Volvos going back for a long time. This little impact wrench has been my favorite little recent thing I bought because it just saves time at the beginning and the end of a project, which is great. I have a spacer on this wheel, which is a little unusual. Most people won't have that. And this is the rear brake caliper, and those are the brake pads. You've got a brake pad and a brake pad, and then there's a retaining spring, and then there's pins right there and right there that have to get knocked out. So I'm going to clean this up, and then the next thing is to take out these pins. So now what I did was just cleaned this up with a wire brush and hit it with some brake cleaner spray, and that makes it look a little bit less, it's much easier to see what is going on now. You can see the brake bleeder screw and the little brake bleeder screw cap. You can see the brake pads, and you can also see there's a shim, which is good to see before you start disassembling things. The shim is there to prevent the pads from vibrating when you apply the brakes, at especially at low speed, I have read. Then you have a retaining spring, and the pins at the bottom and at the top. And the pins, you have to knock them out here, and they'll come out on this side. So that's what I'm going to do now, is now that I've cleaned everything up and can get a look at it before I start disassembling, I'm going to knock these pins out. So to take the pins out, I use a 3mm, it's a 3mm cotter pin, which if I can get them out of the package. Difficult. Yeah, there's the 3mm. I just got these recently. And I'm going to use my favorite old hammer. Of course, I see that one's actually stamped 4 on it. Use my favorite old hammer from my grandfather. And make sure before you start hitting the car that you've got your car up on jack stands and the wheels are chocked and securely jacked. Otherwise, right now you could knock the car off and over. So you tap them out. Looks like this 4mm cotter pin also works fine. The book says use a 3mm, but a 4 is good as well. You can see there's a collar. It's a split collar on the pins that locks in place. Thank you, hammer. and take out the top one, and this spring's loose, so you take out the bottom one, and now it's free to come out. And just make a note of how that went in, or how it was in when you take it out, because it's tempting to want to put it in backwards on the installation process, but it actually goes in like this. Take out the pins, and the split collar, it's important to note, because when you're driving pins in, especially if you put in new pins, this collar is going to make it, it's going to resist being pounded in all the way, but it's important that the pin go in all the way and protrude fully on the other side when you're done. And the pin goes in with the collar on the inside towards the outside. Now, if I'm lucky, these pads will just come out, but they don't. They're stuck a little bit. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bleeder cap off and set that aside, and I'm going to loosen, I'm going to clean up and loosen this bleed screw so that when I squeeze on these pads to get enough space between them and the rotor, the brake fluid can come out of the bleeder nipple rather than have to force the brake fluid all the way back up the lines and into the master cylinder in the engine. I prefer to loosen this and just let the brake fluid come out, and I'll catch it in my pan, and it's easier that way. So I use a 9mm socket, a 6-point socket, and a ratchet to loosen this. I prefer to use a 6-point socket because this bleeder screw is pretty fragile. You can use a wrench. I would use a 6-point box end wrench. Yeah, so that was easy to break loose. And generally what I find is if you have the car, well, I'm not sure why it happens, but in general, when I loosen this bleeder nipple, brake fluid comes out at a steady drip, and I have never so far had a problem with air getting sucked in. But if air does get sucked in, you have to pressure bleed or vacuum bleed the brake lines to get all the air out. So that is a risk of doing what I'm doing, but I have not had that problem. Generally, when I loosen this a little bit, it drips steadily like that, and air does not seem to get into the system. At least I haven't had a problem with having to expel air when I have later pressure bled the brakes. And then you can see when I press on the brake pads with my fingers to push the pistons back in to the caliper, the brake fluid comes out, and it makes it much easier to, in general, it makes it easier to get the pads out. So they're still a little bit stuck, so I'm going to use my favorite, these are my favorite Knipex Cobra pliers. Great pliers because they're so skinny and they're so adjustable to any of, I don't know, 20 different positions with an easy adjust. You can adjust them even when they're closed. You don't have to open them up to a certain angle to adjust them as you would with other adjustable pliers. So I'm taking that out, and I notice on the back that I've got my stainless steel shim mounted here, and it is pointed down to the ground. So I think that's the right orientation. It has not vibrated for me for the past 50,000 miles I've been running them this way, so I'm gonna just put them back in the same way. But make a note of whichever way your shims are installed and put them back in accordingly. And yeah, so that's one brake pad. And then for the other, it should just come right out. Also with the shim, there's an arrow on the shim. It's a half shim, and it's pointing downwards. So these pads are definitely close to worn out. On that edge there, I'd estimate about 1.5 millimeters. And that's just from the shim. That's why it wears more on the bottom side, because the shim is pushing that side of the brake pad against the caliper. So that's okay. So the next step is to, now that we've got the pads out, the next step is to depress or press these pistons back into the calipers so that there's enough room for the new brake pads, which are a lot thicker than the old ones. You can see new versus old. You have to press those back to make room so that these can fit in on both sides. And you have to press them back quite a ways. And on Volvos, this is actually pretty easy compared with some cars, from what I've heard. So what I do, you have to crank the piston. You have to rotate the piston back in. On Volvo, you just press it. So I'm gonna open that bleeder so it's just dripping. I'm gonna take my Knipex again, and without hitting this rubber boot or nicking the rubber boot, if I can, I'm going to slowly and surely, and this pressing is a lot easier when you have the bleeder valve open. And I see my dust boot is kind of swollen, a little bit distended. It does look like I'm going to need to either rebuild these calipers at some point or replace them with rebuilt. And do the same pressing job on the other piston. Yeah, this dust boot is really pretty, it's just all rippled looking and distorted. It doesn't look very good. So I am thinking I'm going to have to get a rebuilt caliper. I could do that now. It would certainly be easier to do it now. But I don't have those calipers at hand. Okay, so those have both been pressed all the way back in. So then just tighten the bleeder nipple up again so that it's not dripping. I got my calipers pressed all the way in. So the next step is to clean up a little bit. I need to clean up some of the debris at the top and the bottom of the inside of the caliper. So I'll do that next. So I cleaned that up a little bit, think the dust boots will be okay. If the dust boot gets torn, then dirt will get into the cylinder and the caliper will seize. I'll have to put a new caliper on. So I went the so-called all luxury route here. Just kidding. With I got some ATE brake pads, and I got new shiny stainless steel shims, even though the old ones I could just clean them up. The shims weren't that expensive. The brake pads were cheap, really. And then I'm going to put the brake pads in, and this one goes in like that, and the shim has to go on like that so that it's on the outside and pointing down, which is how at least how I found it on the car when I took them off. So before putting the pads in, what you have to do is put grease, and this is ATE Plastilube grease, which is expensive relatively, but seems to work pretty well. I haven't had any problems with squealing. And you put you're supposed to put a little bit of grease at the top and the bottom, according to the ATE instructions. You put it on the back of the pad, and then you put the shim on, again pointing down, and then you put more shim on the grease, more grease on the shim, and then with the shim aligned to the pad, you slide it in. And it goes in. So that's great. And then you repeat that on the other side. So you take another pad. They're all interchangeable. You're going to get 4 pads in the box, and they are all the same part. As far as I can tell, there's not like a left and right or in and out. Don't get the grease on the pad itself, just on the edges in the back. And then take a shim, put the shim on. I put it pointing down. I realize I'm repeating myself here. I'm just sort of talking my way through this. And then slide it in. Hopefully I've got that caliper far enough back. If not, I'm going to have to press it a little bit more. I'm going to have to press that caliper in a little bit more. So I loosened this, pressed that in. It did go in another couple of millimeters. And then you put the pad in. And I'm trying to avoid tearing the dust boot because it is sort of sticking out. And then that's the 2 pads installed. So at this point, I am ready to put the pins and the spring back in. And I kind of went for the so-called luxury route and just bought new pins. I could easily have cleaned up and reused the old, and that's not a bad option. These, the old ones are really not in bad shape. I went and got these new ones because, just for convenience, really. So this pin, my intuition whenever I look at it is that it should go on like that, and that these pins are gonna, or the spring is gonna go on like that, and these pins will line up there, but it's backwards. It really goes on like that. And it's a good idea to put a little bit of, well, I don't know. Actually, I say that. I guess it can't hurt to put a little bit of grease right there. It's probably not needed. I think the real place you need the grease is between the pad and the oh, that wants to twist around. The real place you need the grease is between the pad and the piston. So I'm gonna drive that one in and drive this one in. And that spring, when it's new, has actually got a bit of force on it. So those are not in far enough. This is a common mistake, is to not drive these pins in far enough. I think I am going to just put a dab of grease in there and in there. Probably not needed. And then I think it's time to take my my hammer again and drive them home. They're still, you know, now the collars have just come up onto the collars are not compressed yet. Right there and right there. So I need to keep pounding on it until they actually seat. That's a little bit awkward because I gotta hit them from the and again, make sure that you're not gonna you know, knock your car off on you when you're doing this. So use jack stands and a jack, and chock the wheels too. I know I'm repeating myself there, but there's no point learning how to do new skills if you get killed. Oh yeah, that's going in now. That's going in. You can see that one is in, pretty sure it's in all the way. And that one maybe, that one is getting in all the way. You'll feel it in your fingers, and you'll hear it when you bottom out these pins. But it is important to make sure that those pins come all the way, and that the locking collars are in all the way. Otherwise, those pins will back out, or may back out. Your spring will fall out, and your pads could come loose, and that's not what you want. So, new shims, new pads, new spring, new pins, with grease, and I just need to tighten that a little bit more than just the finger tight, and put the rubber cap back on it, and then put the wheel back on, lower the car. Be sure to step on the brake pedal before you drive off, because there's still a gap between these pads and the rotor. And so until you step on the brake pedal a time or two and feel it firm up, you're not going to have really good brake action on the rear until these pads get pressed into the rotor, and then it'll work fine. And then the ATE info sheet says don't do any emergency stopping for the first, I can't remember, 100, 200 kilometers, something like that. And that's it. That's how you do the rear brake pad change. It's pretty easy if things go smoothly. Of course, I still haven't finished this up and tested to make sure it worked.